People on the call, welcome to tryScrum's webcast, I think episode 5 with Melissa Boggs, co-CEO of Scrum Alliance and a Chief Scrum Master with us today. I welcome Melissa. Thank you very much for accepting to talk on the studio today. We are very glad to have you. Before I go and add more information about the talk, I wanted to give a little bit of a logistics information. People on the call, you will be muted throughout because there are many people that might join. So to avoid background noises, you would be muted throughout the session. But you can post your questions on the Q&A window. Anytime you can post, but we are going to dedicate some time at the end of maybe 5 minutes or 10 minutes to take some of your questions. Probably if you need, I can unmute you and you can ask your questions directly. Let's see how the time box goes. And this webinar is hosted by tryScrum Studio in partnership with the different studios we have. As many of you know, our mission is to humanize organizations. Many of you attending all our webcasts without failing. Thank you very much for your support. So we are an intrinsically aligned community of coaches that are trying to humanize organizations. As part of that, we thought we can bring in world-class speakers to share their wisdom and experiences so that it is beneficial to the community. And we are a member of Scrum.org, Scrum Alliance, IC Agile. And for more information about tryScrum, you can visit tryscrum.com. A little bit about the studio. We have been in the community for almost 3 years now. So we just started off with the ScrumMaster Studio community, wherein we think there are a ton of Scrum Masters, but there are a lack of a lot of good Scrum Masters. So with an intention of bringing some good Scrum Masters or maybe instilling right Scrum Mastery, we have started Scrum Master Studio. That idea was very simple. We started on one fine day, then we proliferated into Product Owner Studio, Agile Leadership Studio. So this webcast is sponsored by Agile Leadership Studio in partnership with tryScrum Studio because we think that humanizing organizations, one of the biggest responsibilities of a leader is to build such kind of a culture in the organization. So for more information, again, please visit tryScrum Studios by visiting tryscrum.com. I'm both nervous and excited to introduce Melissa for one reason. I never met Melissa in person, but I know every word is going to be a gold. I've been interacting with Melissa over emails. I saw some of the wisdom. I'm very glad to introduce, she's a co-CEO of Scrum Alliance and the Chief Scrum Master. We are building a very strong mission organization trying to transform the way the world works. Melissa is also a certified enterprise coach, and as a consultant and executive, she has consistently embodied the Scrum values, and she's super good in facilitation. So that's my experience. A lot of things to learn. And I'm very glad to welcome Melissa on behalf of the tryScrum crew on the studio. Over to you.
You are too kind. Thank you so much for what a lovely introduction. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I am really, really excited. It's morning here for me. I know it's evening for you, but this is a wonderful way to start my day to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is storytelling. Let me start by sharing my screen.
Perfect. Yep.
All right. So first, you introduced me, but again, my name is Melissa Boggs. I am the co-CEO and Chief Scrum Master at Scrum Alliance. This is a dream job for me, one that I've been in for almost 2 years, and I was a member of Scrum Alliance for many, many years before ever stepping into this role. As Venkatesh mentioned, I'm a certified enterprise coach, and I have built my own career around working with organizations also to humanize them and to help us just get the best out of all of us, for work to be a place that is joyful, prosperous, and sustainable, which is part of our vision at Scrum Alliance. one of the things that I have found in my years of coaching that has been so much more powerful than we ever actually give it credit is the power of storytelling. And this is one of my favorite things to talk about. And so today I'm going to walk you through why storytelling is important, how to tell a good story, and then how to identify stories. I think one of the most difficult things for people is to recognize when there is a story to tell, much less to tell it. So we'll talk about a couple of those things over the next hour. And then I'm also going to nudge you to start thinking about your stories and what stories might you tell. So we will do all of that together for the next hour. So the topic today was the power of storytelling in cultural change. And I want to first just level set a little bit about culture. This word is used over and over again, especially, in the Agile and Scrum world. And it's a really important word, but a lot of people have different definitions for it. So for the purposes of my talk today, I want to define culture as the traditions, habits, and behaviors of a group of people. In our context, it will be organizations or companies. And those traditions, habits, and behaviors are a reflection of that group of people's values. This is important as we sort of talk about storytelling, because storytelling is hugely a tradition, whether we realize it or not. And so for today's purposes, culture is traditions, habits, behaviors that are based on an organization or a group of people's values. When we think about organizational change, organizational success, often in today's world, we use that term loosely, organizations are really focused on results. What we're looking at right now is the results pyramid by Partners in Leadership. And I really love this because it points out that the results are just the tip of the pyramid. It's just the top. And there's a whole lot of things that go into results. In order to get results, you have to take action. But in order to take action, you have specific beliefs, whether you realize it or not. And those beliefs are built by experiences. And so when we think about experiences that would form our beliefs, excuse me, things that happen every day at work begin to form what we believe about the organization, what we believe about the people that we work with. And those beliefs, again, inform our actions, which eventually inform our results. So at the end of the day, the most important thing in this pyramid are our experiences, and not just our own experiences, but the experiences of people around us. Because when people experience something, they tell others about it. So I'll take it out of the work context for a moment and think about, when was the last time that you had a wonderful experience at a restaurant or really, really good customer service from a company? When you have that sort of experience, you tell people. And so now not only have you had this experience and developed a belief about that company or that restaurant, but you've shared that with someone else, and they have now probably formed at least a shallow belief about that company or restaurant as well. So as you can see, experiences and storytelling are actually quite deeply tied to one another. In this pyramid in particular, you can see often we're trying to manage actions and results. And through storytelling, through sharing experiences with our teammates, the people that we lead, we can shift that balance and start building a much stronger foundation through experiences and beliefs. This is the difference between trying to control results and actions and the culture of an organization, and instead creating and sharing experiences that will influence it. And I love this particular quote: "The only way to change human behavior is to woo instead of preach, to love instead of threatening disaster, to point out how glorious something could be, and in some way to live it." So instead of saying, well, if we don't get these results from this company, by the end of the year, then we're in trouble. Instead, to bring in stories and talk about how wonderful it would be if we were actually able to achieve these results. The thing about storytelling that is incredibly important is that it's innate, it's part of human nature. All the way back to ancient times, families have told stories, to the next generation in order to carry on their culture. So I have very distinct memories of being, a little child, much like this young lady in this picture, sitting at my grandmother's feet while she told stories of her parents, of her aunts and uncles. And that was teaching me our culture. It was teaching me what was important to our family. It was teaching me our values. And so instead of her saying, like, this is how we are, and just sort of, imposing it upon me, all she had to do was tell me our stories. And I was deeply influenced by that. And then I went on to tell those stories to my own children. And so storytelling is part of who we are. It is, we actually have neurons in our brain that are called mirror neurons. And so if I tell you a story, then your brain is wired to basically reflect back and tell you almost as if you were there. So if I'm describing emotions, you also feel those emotions. It's sort of like watching a movie. When you're watching a movie, you're not necessarily in that very sad or happy moment, but you might feel like you are. And that is because of the mirror neurons in our brains. And so all of these things combined together allow us to share experiences that we may not have even been there for. And again, that takes us back to then creating beliefs that are based on something that someone else told us. So let's talk a little bit about how to tell a good story. And then we'll get into, after that, how to identify a good story. So in terms of storytelling, first of all, just identifying it, and we'll get into that in a minute, how to know if something is a story to tell. But once you've identified the story, then it's about describing impact. So it's funny because when we talk about sprint reviews, we tell teams not to go in and talk about what you did, but rather the value that you delivered. And that's really similar to this. Don't just tell me what happened, but tell me how it impacted you. Tell me how you felt. Tell me how it changed your thinking. Tell me how it challenged you. But do all of that while keeping it simple. So one trap that people can fall into is, telling a really complex story. And about halfway through the story, you've lost the other person because it's just so detailed and complicated that they're no longer following it. It's hard to understand. In the end, what matters to people is that impact piece and how you made them feel. You're trying to help them feel the same thing that you did because it had an impact on you, obviously. And so now you want it to have an impact on them. And I love this quote by Maya Angelou, that says, I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And so describing that impact helps them feel what you felt. And I'll give you a couple examples in a minute of different stories that describe impact. Before I do, I just want to take a moment here. Frankly, if we were in person, this is where I would have you talk in your table. So, but nonetheless, I want you to take a moment and just think about something that has happened in the last week, something that has happened at work in the last week that you learned from, that caused you to feel, that caused you to be excited, that caused you to be really motivated to do something at work. And I want you to first identify that story in your mind, and then think about how it impacted you. So think about why you even remember it right now. What about that moment, what about that experience impacted you? And how would you describe that impact to someone else? Whether it's someone else at work or maybe it's even a family member. How would you describe not necessarily just what happened, but how it impacted you and why it came to mind for you right now? And how you might describe that in a very simple way that gets across the impact, but doesn't make it so complicated that someone else can't understand. So I'm actually going to give you just a minute to think about that. Okay, hold on to that story for just a minute in the back of your mind. So one of the most difficult things when I've talked to organizations about storytelling, and even my own team, we talk about storytelling at Scrum Alliance all the time. And one of the most difficult things for people is just identifying a story to tell. Interestingly, some people feel really self-conscious about telling their story because they feel like it's bragging, or they feel like it's, trying to make it about them. And I often tell them it's not really about you, actually. Like when you are telling a story like that, what you're seeking to do actually is create an experience for someone else. It's not selfish. It's, I learned something from this, or I enjoyed this experience, or, I figured something out, and you're sharing it with someone else so that they can benefit from that experience. So one of the ways that I try to help people through that is to teach them different types of stories to look out for. And so we talk about these at Scrum Alliance quite a bit in our team of 55, about the different types of stories and how to sort of keep an eye out for them so that when you're in the middle of one, you can actually recognize that you are. And you can say, oh, hey, this is a really interesting bottom-up story that would be useful for other people to learn about. And so we're going to talk about top-down, bottom-up, inside out, and outside in. And I'll give you an example of each one of these. So starting with top-down stories. This, by the way, presumes sort of a hierarchical type of situation in a company. So top-down is obviously someone in a leadership role, but that's just the name of it. It doesn't necessarily have to be, a title that you have. But someone who is in a leadership role who wants to share a story with the people who either report to them or you're just leading, whether it's formally or not. So an example of a top-down story and why it is important. Several years ago, I was working with a young woman who was the chief operating officer of her organization. And she was quite young for her role, but very, very good at her job. We were talking about sort of the state of the company and really came to the realization that the company could use a refresh of their mission statement, and decided we wanted to do a mission, vision, values exercise. In my experience, doing mission, vision, value exercises are really impactful when you involve, all of the employees. And so I was really encouraging her to work with all of the employees to come up with what the new mission statement might be. But she was a little reticent. She was a little nervous about that. And at one point, she finally got really honest with me, and she said, I'm a little worried that if I ask everyone to help me with that they might perceive that I don't know what I'm doing, that I don't know what the mission is. And I said, perhaps, but I shared with her a story. Now, this was actually sort of an outside-in story, but I shared with her a story of a time when the company that I worked for years prior was doing their mission statement, and they asked all of the employees for their opinions. And I was a young person, and I felt really included. I felt really important, that it mattered what I thought about the mission. Ultimately, the CEO still made the decision, but I really appreciated being asked, and I shared that with her. So she decided to go ahead and do that. She decided to go ahead and involve the entire company in building the mission statement. That's not the important part of this story. The important part of this story is after it was all done, she shared with the company in a town hall type of thing that she had been nervous, that she was afraid people would think she didn't know what she was doing simply by, asking for their input. And she shared how wrong she was, that she recognized that asking for their input didn't mean that, she didn't know what she was doing, but rather that she valued their opinions. And that vulnerability, her willingness to share with everyone, A, that she was nervous, and B, that she was wrong, that, people weren't going to think that about her, and that ultimately was the right thing to ask. Sharing of that created all kinds of space inside the organization. Her displaying vulnerability, her displaying her appreciation for their input, just telling that story reverberated throughout the organization. Her being vulnerable gave other people permission to be vulnerable. Her appreciation of their input gave other people permission to seek other people's input and not feel like it was a weakness or something wrong. And it was incredibly powerful, because when a leader is willing to demonstrate that vulnerability, it gives everyone else permission. So that would be an example of a top-down story, a time when someone in leadership can tell their story, giving other people permission, and also demonstrating values, demonstrating actions or behaviors that we believe to be ones that we want to share and that we want other people in the organization to demonstrate as well. So that would be an example of a top-down story. An example of a bottom-up story. I think about this also as grassroots. There's a phrase, grassroots, that means like it starts small. It starts with like one small group, in this case, one small team, and then it spreads kind of out and up all at the same time. So an example of a bottom-up story is, a team in say it's a fairly large organization, a team in an organization that is, doing something unique or special, and they're sharing that with other people. And in doing so, that sort of spreads and other people get excited about it. So for this example, I'll actually use a Scrum Alliance team. I won't name them, but we have 7 teams at Scrum Alliance, and there was one in particular very early on in my being there that was really doing some very daring things, if you will. They were really experimenting, they were trying things, they were taking risks, and it was paying off. And we actually have, at Scrum Alliance in our Slack instance, we have a storytelling channel. And in that channel, we encourage, anyone in the organization to tell a story and to tell their story. So I was really encouraging this team to tell their story, because the type of risks they were taking with, the things they were experimenting with from a product perspective, from a service perspective to their community, were the types of things that I wanted other teams to do as well. And so one of the members of that team became one of the biggest storytellers in the organization. They would, and these were not all happy stories all the way through. And I think that's an important thing to point out. Often some of the best stories are the gritty ones. They're the stories where we struggled, and came out on the other side and learned something. And so this one particular team member, it almost became kind of a joke, not a joke, but a funny thing, because they would, anytime that they had sort of a struggle, he would go and share, and he would share what they learned from it. And I so came to appreciate that, because it gave other teams permission not only to struggle, but to share their struggles. And it gave them new ideas. So when his team would go through something and he would share it, whatever it was that they came out on the other side with, whatever the solution was, or whatever they tried, even if it didn't work, would spark things for other teams and for other people. And, other people would then feel like they could tell their story too and go, oh yes, we really struggled with that as well. And here's something that we came up with, and suddenly you have multiple people across the organization that are talking about their struggles and sharing their solutions. And that part is so important. So again, a bottom-up story is sort of a specific small group inside the larger group that is sharing their struggle, sharing their solution, and giving other people permission to do so as well. Our next story, our next story is Inside Out, and this is sort of what you would imagine as, sometimes this could be construed as marketing. And I want to make sure I point out that that's not what I'm talking about here. It's not necessarily marketing, but these are the stories inside the organization that you are sharing outside of the organization, that you are telling friends and family and other companies and your customers. And there's a very interesting phenomenon that happens with inside out stories. Obviously, if you tell your stories to people outside of the company, then there's an impact on them, right? Like they understand more about what's going on inside. They are inspired, they are excited. But what's just as, or maybe more interesting, is the effect that it has on you when you tell your story to someone outside of the organization. So I'll give you another Scrum Alliance example. Just over a year ago, we undertook a huge transformation at Scrum Alliance. And I don't use that word lightly. We literally restructured everything about the company in April of 2019. And it was a very difficult time. Like, we knew it was the right thing to do, but any time that you are basically reorganizing a company, especially in the extreme way that we did, it's really challenging. People are fearful. People are unsure of what's going to happen next. There's a lot of uncertainty, and you're just logistically trying to figure out how to work. So in our case, we moved from being a very traditional departmental company to 7 Scrum teams, 7 completely cross-functional Scrum teams. Each one of our team has marketing, IT, education, support, community, all in one team. And it was really hard. And I'll be really honest, I'm telling you a little bit of my story right now, but I had a lot of moments of worry and, are we doing the right thing? Is this all going to work out okay? But I knew that we couldn't go wrong if we were really leaning into our values. So where the inside out story comes in is roughly 6 weeks after we did all of this, it was actually time for our global Scrum gathering in Austin. And we have roughly 55 people at the organization, and usually about half of them attend our global Scrum gatherings, to work and to see the community and whatnot. And so we always have a trainer and coach retreat just prior to the gathering. And so half of our company that is undergoing this huge transformation is at this retreat with our community. And I begin to notice that they're telling our story. Our team members are telling our trainers and coaches all about this transformation that we've been undergoing for the last 6 weeks. And they're not pretending that it is, all rainbows. But the more that they're talking about it, the more that I'm beginning to realize that they're gaining pride. So what happens to you when you tell your story to someone else is you begin to own your story more deeply. You begin to connect with whatever your experience was more deeply. So when we begin to tell our stories inside out, from inside the company to people outside the company, then we begin to connect with them more. And this is where we really can start to see some cultural shift. Because now, not only am I, sort of having lived this experience, but as I'm telling my family member or a customer this story, I'm becoming more proud of it. I'm owning it. I'm excited about it. And you'll find that, like, after you've told the story, you're actually more excited than you were when it was happening. And so it was really neat to see these team members telling this story and becoming more proud of it, taking more ownership of, yeah, we're changing, and yeah, we're becoming a different company, and it really is hard, but we're proud of it and we're excited. And so that would be an example of an inside out story and the impact that it can have on you, the storyteller, as well as the person that you're telling it to. So our last type of story is outside in. And so these are stories from outside the organization that would impact how excited and how plugged in you are to the mission of the organization. So these are customer stories. For this particular story, I want to share about a company that I always say that I grew up in this story. In this company. I started working at this company when I was 20 years old, and I worked there for 12 years, almost 13. And so much of my professional foundation or growth was at this company. This was a very, very mission-driven company. We provided medical equipment to people who couldn't walk. And so it was very mission-driven. It was very impactful even just to work there, because there were people who couldn't normally get to the kitchen to make themselves a meal on their own or to the restroom by themselves. And we provided them with equipment that allowed them to do that independently. That was really, really important to us. And one of the most impactful things that the CEO of the company did was, on a very regular basis, probably, I can't remember if it was once a month or quarterly, but we would have basically pep rallies. We would have these big town halls. Everyone would come together, and this was 1,800 people in this company. And every single time he would bring an outside-in story. He would bring a customer email or a customer voicemail or a message from a family member of a customer, and he would share that with us. And these were often very, very emotional stories. I mean, I talked about impact. It's very impactful when someone writes in to say, because of the equipment that you provided to my mother, she doesn't have to go into a nursing home. Or someone leaves a voicemail, and they would actually play the voicemails for us on the, big speakers. And it would be this, this elderly woman who was saying thank you, and she's crying because, happy tears, because she's able to take care of herself. And she doesn't have to wait, for her child to come and help her get to the restroom. She can go by herself now because she has a wheelchair. And so these stories frequently helped us stay connected to what we were doing. It's really easy in a company, no matter how impactful your product is, to become very focused. Like if you're a software developer, I'm writing code. I'm writing code in this software, and it's easy to become very focused on that and to lose sight on the impact that you're having, that you really are tied to this greater mission. And so by bringing these outside in stories and telling those, or allowing the customers to tell them for you, you are creating this connection to the mission that motivates people. It's far more motivating than, bonuses, when you recognize how much you are impacting someone else and that the work you're doing is valuable. And so outside in stories are incredibly important because they, again, keep us connected to the mission. So those are the 4 types of stories. I want to take a few minutes and, again, this would be the part where we would normally have some table talks, but I want to just take a minute and think about some of your stories. So of the 4 story types, and I'll run back over them again in just a moment, I want you to think about what resonated with you most. So was it the top-down stories where leaders are sort of expressing vulnerability and giving other people permission to learn as well? Was it bottom-up where it's the team that is doing something really interesting or risky and they're sharing that with everyone else, gives them ideas? Is it inside out, where by telling your stories to people outside of the organization, you are not only impacting them, but it's impacting you because you're taking ownership of that story? Or is it outside in? Is it the customer stories that really help you to connect with the mission? So I want you to take just a moment and think about those 4 story types. Which resonated with you the most? And are there any stories that immediately come to mind? We don't often take time to think about these kind of things. So I would encourage you to jot down a Post-it note if any of these resonated with you and there are any that come to mind. So I'm going to give you just a minute to think about those things. Okay. The next thing I want you to think about is, what is the most commonly told story in your organization? Often, just like stories can help to shift the culture, they're often very reflective of the culture as well. And so, as someone who is interested in, understanding and shifting your culture, it's really helpful to understand what is the most commonly told story. Is it stories? Is it a story of risk and reward, or is it a story of um, people being frustrated? Is it a story of we can't get anything done, because it has to go through 4 layers of approval? Or is it a story of, we're really connected to our customers? So, what is the most commonly told story in your organization? And what does that story tell you and others about your culture? So, I want you to take a minute and think about that, and maybe jot down a couple of Post-it notes about that as well. And my last set of questions for you is, what are some opportunities to tell a new story? So often, the culture in our organization can be shifting. But if we continue to tell our old stories and we don't tell the new stories, then that shift is going to be a lot slower. So if the story that is most commonly told in your organization isn't an ideal one, if the story that's most commonly told is, we can never get anything done here because it takes 4 layers of approval before we can get anything done, but perhaps that's no longer true, or perhaps there are other paths, but that story isn't being told yet. We're still telling the same old story from last year, rather than telling the news story. So, what are some opportunities to tell a news story? What are some things that have shifted, but maybe not everyone knows it yet? And then what are some channels that you could use or create to tell those stories? And I use that word channel figuratively and literally. I mentioned earlier that, at Scrum Alliance, we actually have a storytelling channel in our Slack instance exactly for this purpose. Exactly for the purpose of telling new stories and helping those stories to propagate across the organization. And so I want you to take another moment and think about, what are some opportunities to tell a new story, and what are some channels that you could use if they already exist, or that you could create in order to tell those stories. Okay. Since we have a little bit of time, I thought I'd go back and share some of my answers to these questions. Um, of the 4 story types, I think the one that resonates with me the most, at least right now, I think this changes, but the one that resonates the most with me right now is the outside in stories. And you could probably tell by the way I was talking about it. But for me, Scrum Alliance in particular, we are a service organization. We are literally here to serve the membership of Scrum Alliance. So it really resonates with me when we can, bring in stories and talk about ways in which our organization has been able to impact people. In particular, a story that comes to mind recently is we're supporting basically an agile and education movement where there are teachers of kindergarten through 12th grade that are using Scrum in their classroom, and through sponsorship and through some of our trainers, we're actually helping these teachers understand how to use Scrum in their classroom, how to help their classrooms become agile classrooms. And so anytime we hear stories from places like Hope High School, it's just really exciting. That helps keep us connected, that what we're doing isn't just for today, but actually for the future, because, these children will grow up in this environment and then go on to teach their own organizations how to use Scrum when they're adults. So outside in stories are particularly impactful to me right now. The most commonly told story in our organization. For a long time, I think the most commonly told story was our reorganization. It was the fact that we changed everything a little over a year ago. And that was a good story. That was a story that we're proud of. But I am really happy that of late, the most commonly told story in our organization is about us now. It's about how we work in Scrum teams. It's about how we don't have managers. And so there is a lot more freedom to get things done without approval. And so I'm glad that it has shifted from all the change that happened to actually how we work now, and how that, our team members are really proud of that. And so what that tells me about our culture is that, we have begun to shift, and that there is a new story, and that the channels that we created to share that new story really are beginning to impact the culture in general. The last thing I want to mention about stories in general is that probably the most impactful, powerful story that you can tell is the story that you tell yourself. Often we get, sort of caught up in our own head, and we begin to tell ourselves that this isn't going to work, or we aren't, important enough, or we can't make a difference in our company. And when we tell ourselves that, it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, where if we tell ourselves that we can make a difference, that the story that we tell other people can impact them, then that too can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so I really encourage people, I get asked a lot, how can I really make a difference in the culture of my company when I'm just one person? And, I work in a 5,000 person company or a 10,000 person company, and I'm just one person. But if we think about those 4 different story types, there are really many different ways that one person can start a chain reaction. Whether it's you telling your story and giving permission to someone else to tell their story, or giving them ideas and giving them permission to tell their story, there are many ways that we can make a difference. But we first have to start by telling ourselves that is true, that is the case. I like to think about cultural shifts as movements, as human movements. And storytelling is a really powerful piece of that. One by one, as we tell our stories, we find common ground. When I tell my story to you, some of the stories I told you today, there might be pieces of those stories that you could relate to. And so then we begin to find common purpose. And I just love the musical Hamilton. So I love this line that says, it's not a moment, it's the movement. It's not just this one story, but the culmination of all of our stories that begin to shift the culture of an organization and our movement in general. The last thing I'll ask you is, who is telling your story? Because at the end of the day, stories get told. So either you can tell your story, or someone might tell it for you in such a way that doesn't resonate with you, that isn't the true story. So I really encourage you to look for ways, identify those stories, look for ways to tell them, describe the impact of that story on you and the impact that it can have on other people, and ultimately be the person who tells your story. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Melissa. Thanks a ton. That was really enlightening. At least to me, stories telling sounds esoteric to many people, right? When they hear storytelling, should we tell, where do we start, and what kind of story should we say? Should we adapt according to the situation? So I have a couple of questions from participants, which I wanted to give it to you for your thoughts. So there's a question from a participant. People usually remember more negative events, such as layoffs, pay cuts, right? And telling stories about it within the organization. This will probably demotivate people, or they may get into panic mode. So what kind of storytelling approach could we use in those situations so that we make the situation much more better?
I love that. That's sort of what I was talking about when I said, what's the most commonly told story? Obviously, it's very common to, for those to be negative stories. And I think the strategy has to be to look for ways to replace that story with a new story. And sometimes those stories are small. They don't have to be, layoffs are these huge stories, right? But sometimes it's the really small things that sort of add up to replace that story. And frankly, sometimes it has to be as direct as saying, listen, I know that was a really important story at a certain time, but that was then, and here we are now. Here's today, and here's what's going on today. And whatever story that you can sort of extricate, thinking about those 4 story types, it might be, yes, we had layoffs, but we still have all of these customers who need us, and bringing those outside in stories to say, okay, but there's still, this many of us here now, and these customers still need us. So how do we rally together?
Yeah, that's a good insight. And there is another interesting question. I'll take and finally go with Jesse's question. So on your slide, you had creating and sharing experience, and you mentioned that the behavior changes would be to talk positives and not focus on the negative outcomes. Little bit aligned with the same question, but the perspective from a participant is, I would rather tell the facts to people. For example, he had a situation where a project was almost going to die, but the calm and composed nature of the manager or a leader did not convey the right message to people, but because everybody with the presumption that everything going well. So his question was, would that not be fair to share facts with the people directly so that you can save some of the crucial situations you can recover from that?
Of course. I tell our team all the time, like, this isn't, for example, our storytelling channel that we use at Scrum Alliance. The storytelling channel is not rainbows and unicorns. And I don't think that I did say necessarily that it has to always be positive. But what I am saying is that you look for the things you can learn from. And so often our stories in the storytelling channel aren't like everything was perfect. In fact, I would discourage that. I would encourage us to tell the real story, because the beauty in the real story is through that struggle, or through that manager. I would hope that story would come from the manager themselves, meaning, hey, I didn't do this well, but I learned from it, and here's what I'll do differently next time. That's the beauty in that story, is that something came out of that on the other side that made us better.
Makes sense. An interesting question from Jesse. Advise us on what makes for a good story versus a boring or irrelevant one.
I mean, impact at the end of the day. Like, it would be very boring for me to say, I walked to the store, I bought some milk, and I walked back home. But if I said, on my walk to the store, I heard some birds singing, and it filled me with joy. I got to the store, and I bought some milk, and I smiled at the cashier, and their smile back filled me with joy. And then I walked home, and on my walk home, I helped a woman cross the street. All of those things, it's the same story, but I'm describing the things along the way that impacted me. That's what makes the difference between a boring story and an interesting one that resonates with people, is impact.
Sounds like a narrative mastery. We need to go through a journey.
Right.
So the last question in the spirit of time, Melissa, thank you very much for that. So as someone joins a new organization, they probably get only NPS from the Glassdoor, right? One of the famous platforms where people can go and read the Glassdoor reviews often. So how can an organization spread its wings beyond that data for such people?
So is the question like once they actually arrive, or before they get there?
I think the question is once they arrive. they have already joined the organization, probably they might be looking at the Glassdoors and they may presume a lot of stuff. Maybe the bad spreads faster, right?
Right. I think this is where it's really important. Two things are really important for an organization is to have some sort of cultural immersion when someone arrives at the organization. This usually takes the form of new employee orientation. But going beyond, here's the handbook, and actually telling stories. That company that I referred to where I worked for so long, we had a week-long new employee orientation. And one of the most impactful moments of the week was when the owner would come and talk about the very first piece of equipment that he delivered. And he would talk about what that was like. And every single time he would cry, which really impacted me. I mean, I still remember that many, many, many years later. So first it's finding ways to tell stories in that first week, if you can. And then I think the second piece is some sort of buddy system where you know, even if it's informally, have some sort of mentor or buddy, and it's someone who can also tell their stories. Like, why are you still here? You know, what do you love about working here? What are your customer stories? Those are the types of things that can help someone see beyond Glassdoor.
Great. So I also resonate with the stories Zappos. They pay you when you quit. When you decide to quit in a couple of weeks, they pay you for that. That really motivates people. A company is even going to that level to really proliferate their values and culture. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an interesting perspective. The last question I would like to take: how do you tell a story that the company would not want to share?
How do you tell a story that the company would not want to share?
Want you to share. I'm sorry, I messed
Sure.
up.
I have a lot of questions about that question. Just simply because I would be interested to know what, while the stories don't have to be positive, what I would hope is that you're trying to create a positive effect by telling the story. And so I have a lot of questions about that question, about why, before I'd be able to answer it.
So, Claria, in the spirit of time, we may not be able to accommodate more questions. We accommodated as much as we can, so we already overrun 2 minutes. Thank you all the participants and Melissa for being here, sharing with wonderful experiences along with the great examples, especially talking about the power of storytelling. We look forward to hosting you maybe version 2 in some time. Probably the recording of this webinar would be available on the YouTube channel of tryScrum Studio. So keep a watch. Thank you very much, all the participants. So I wanted to also talk about the upcoming webcasters. If you think this is exciting, you really got some value out of this webinar, there are some good speakers lined up in the month of August and September. You can go to tryscrum.com/webcast. You can find all those talks and webcasts that is coming up in August and September. Once again, Melissa, thank you a ton for being with us. I really appreciate on behalf of tryScrum Studio and the crew. Thank you very much. Stay safe. Look forward to seeing you sometime.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.